Hello and welcome to Teams Basics, Maximizing Office Productivity. My name's Nate. I'll be guiding you through the session today, and then behind the scenes, Stephanie is producing, and we'll be making sure the Q&A panel gets handled. Let's just dig in. One of the things, quick takes from this session. Look, we've learned that there are some core function of Teams that we shouldn't assume that people know exist. Even folks have been using Teams since they got thrust into it pre-pandemic or right in the pandemic. We found that they're not always using some of the core functionality of Teams. So we want to make sure that we can show a little bit about that. We've also found that there are Teams beginners out there that are struggling or frustrated or afraid to ask questions. They don't want to feel dumb. And so that's something, this session is really for those folks on your team to help them feel more comfortable. So we're going to get tips for Teams beginners. And the other thing that we're trying to talk about today is like get some of the foundation down so your organization can grow in the same direction. We found that sometimes if you're not clear on these things, you might have some people pulling in this direction and that direction, but you're not going to really optimize and get the benefit out of all this unless you're going all in the same direction. So that's also what we're going to hit on today as well. So this session, look, we just want to increase awareness with how to execute some of the basics of Teams. We want to talk about, we'll just hit on really quick some of the common challenges we see with organizations, even those who have been using Teams for months or years. Then we'll get into the demonstration. We'll actually walk through a bunch of this stuff as far as what are the Teams basics, some of the nuances that we've learned that even folks who've been using it for quite a while don't necessarily know exist, and so we'll touch on that, and then open it up for some recommended action items and Q&A at the end. So before we dig into the content, I always like to hit on 1 minute about MyTech. Look, we are a business and technology consulting organization that over the last 22 years of being in business, we help implement a proven IT strategy that we know delivers consistent and reliable results for our clients. It ultimately removes IT challenges for you. It helps you focus on your customers and being able to be more adaptable to other business challenges we all inevitably face. And working together, our clients can achieve 4 times more value and productivity from their IT investments. That's not why you're here today, but if you're interested in learning more about that, please raise your hand. We'd love to have a chat. But again, that's not why you're here today. So let's move on. Common problems, Teams basics. Okay, so first of all, for the first time in 20 years ish, there's this stuff's different. It used to be, I remember back in the day when MyTech first started, a lot of what we were helping people do was go from dial-up connections, so we're still using AOL or whatever the dial-up was at the time, to moving over to high-speed internet connections. And so being able to be online all the time, use an internet browser, using domain-based email, that was different. And guess what? Back then, we did a lot of training then too. And then for about 20 years, training didn't really exist because it didn't really change that much. Well, guess what? Now it has. And so we believe individuals need basic training so they don't feel dumb using a new tool. We've definitely seen some resistance where people feel uncomfortable, especially in a group setting, raising their hand because they don't want to be the one that doesn't know. And so being intentional about training and covering things like this Teams Basics session is what we've learned from feedback from different clients we've worked with that is a really important variable. So we wanted to share this with you today. Again, people are also uncomfortable with change. As I mentioned, for the last 20 years, we've gotten used to Outlook and Word and Excel and our file servers. Well, this stuff changes everything. And so there's some discomfort with this, and there's some inertia and momentum that it takes to kind of get over some of those humps. So, but covering some of the basics will help you work towards that goal. The years of familiarity with Outlook and email, we're going to touch on that. And we've also found that many organizations over the last few years, unless they were intentional about using the Teams section of Teams, again, I will do a little mug show here. We actually made a mug, navigate to Teams to find the Teams session so you can collaborate with your teams. We'll talk about that here in a second. But a lot of people have only used the chat function of Teams versus the Teams function of Teams. So we're hoping that this will help you create some awareness if that's your organization. We've also found, again, resistance because of all these variables, and not necessarily any one of them, but maybe a combination of all the above. There's a resistance to get everyone onto the same page, and it's hard to do, candidly. As depending on the size of your organization, it's hard to kind of get people and nudge them onto the same page. But hopefully, some of these basics will help you start that journey as well. And then what also comes from not being on the same page, not rowing in the same direction, not having basic training, is that people are confused as far as what tool to use, even what parts of the tool to use. And that's one of the things we're going to cover today versus the chat section, to give examples of the chat section of Teams versus the Teams section of Teams. So these are some of the common challenges that we've seen across organizations, and we're going to cover in our demo. And I want to spend as much time as possible in the demo because that's really where you kind of see how this stuff really can potentially have an impact for you. So the next step, let's get into the demonstration. I'm going to pull up my demo environment here. And in our demo environment, I'm actually going to, go to Teams. In theory. Okay, so I wanted to start with some of the basic navigation function of some of the menus and navigation. Again, Teams basics. I want you, these are things that I don't want to presume that people understand or know how to navigate. So first and foremost, I always like to illustrate a couple menus that are and give names to them. So when we use the language, you're familiar with what I mean and what we mean as an organization. So there's here's, for instance, when you see these three little dots, we call them breadcrumbs. Some people have called them the ellipses, but we call them breadcrumbs. We like to stick with food analogies here for the menus. You'll see. Sometimes the breadcrumbs will appear here without hovering over it. Sometimes the breadcrumbs will appear, as you notice, as I hover over the different chats. The breadcrumbs will appear when I hover over the chats, and that gives me additional access to information. Sometimes you'll see breadcrumbs up here as well when I hover over. There's breadcrumbs throughout the Teams and SharePoint environment. We're not going to get too much into SharePoint today, but whenever you see the breadcrumbs, there's always additional options and features and capabilities that exist. So be aware of that. And sometimes they're here, sometimes they're vertical versus horizontal. And sometimes you need to hover over the respective area in order to see the breadcrumbs. So I always like to call that out. The waffle is another one. So the reason why I want to pull up the waffle is because if you go to office.com, I'm just going to pull up a browser. One of the things about Teams Basics that I like to call out is office.com. Because if you're not familiar with, actually, I think I pulled up the wrong browser, excuse me. I want to pull up office.com, my other browser that doesn't auto log me in. But office.com is a place where you can find all of the tools to which you have access when you log in. So for instance, and a lot of the apps that we're going to talk about today have a browser-based version as well, including Teams. But one thing that I like to highlight about office.com is that if you're struggling to know where to navigate or to find an application, you can use the waffle. So this little menu item right up here in the corner, this 9-dot grid, we call the waffle. And so, for instance, I'm going to open up Teams from the browser, and you'll notice that the waffle appears in the browser version of Teams. You'll see it right up here in the corner as soon as it resolves. But I like to show how to navigate to it. So the waffle will show up right here in the corner. And the only difference between really the Teams browser version, for the most part, and the Teams application, which we're going to use for the demonstration today, is really this menu right here in the corner. And I'll illustrate that by pulling up Teams, the application, and you'll notice the same menus exist, but except that waffle does not exist up here like it does in the browser version. So I like to show the waffle. The other one I like to show is the hamburger. Whenever you see three lines like this, sometimes you'll see it instead of a funnel-looking thing, it'll have just three equal lines. You don't see that very often, but the hamburger is the other menu that I like to share. So I talked a little bit about the browser, again, using the browser version of Teams versus the Teams app. Basically same functionality, it's just via the browser, and you can get there via office.com like I just illustrated. But then I want to highlight some of the menus along the side so that you're familiar with how to navigate the components of Teams. So the activity bell, this is where all of your notifications will exist. And I'll show this later. I'm going to let some of the notifications build up. You see I've got one there because of this. I'm sure that's the one from Stephanie sending me a message. My chat section of Teams, the Teams section of Teams. Again, that's why I was illustrating the mug, because we'll illustrate that more later. And then there's a calendar in Teams that has a unique function. Even though it integrates with your Outlook calendar, there's some components of scheduling meetings as a part of Teams Basics that you can only do in the Teams calendar versus the Outlook calendar. We're going to get to that here in a little bit. I'm not going to hit on calls or some of these other options because most people don't necessarily have that. If you're using Teams Voice or something, you would, but I'm not going to touch on that because that's a little bit extra, but this is just Teams Basics. And so let's start with the chat section of Teams. So I'm in the chat section of Teams. One of the things I always like to illustrate is this is where, if you want to create a new chat, it's not intuitive. So I'm going to hit a new chat, and I'm just going to pick, let's see if I think I've got another person on our team in here. I'm going to pick Jeff Woods. So new chat with Jeff Woods, and that's how I can create a new chat with Jeff Woods. Now, I already have a chat with Jeff Woods, so it shows that. With Jeff, so I'm posting that here. But then what I want to do is I always like to illustrate, so this is how you can create a chat, but sometimes you want to add more people to the chat. So one of the things you can do is up here, I can do a couple things. I can click here to add people. And when I choose this, I'm going to pick JF on our team here. I'm going to hit add. And so now it's creating a group chat. And notice it says you're starting a new conversation because I didn't have this group chat before. So this is me starting a new group chat. So now Jeff and JF, Jonathan, are part of this chat. And again, I've created it by adding the new button. You could also do that by starting here and hitting new and just typing multiple people at the same time. But one of the things I like to illustrate if you're creating a group chat is that you can rename it. Once you add more than one person to the chat, you can actually come in here to this little edit button here, and now I can name the chat. I'm just call it rename the group chat and save. So now instead of showing up as JF and Jeff, it shows up as rename the group chat up in my channel or in my column here. So one of the reasons why I like to show that is because very oftentimes a group chat has a purpose to it. Sometimes it's just the name of of a subset of a team or maybe a committee. Sometimes it might be a short-term group project, or it might be planning for your annual banquet or something like that, where it might be just something that gets together and you pull this group of people together ad hoc to be able to coordinate and communicate. And this is exactly how you can do that. So you could call this the annual banquet planning committee or something like that. And while that chat is happening, if it has a purpose like that, I like to be able to use another function here under the breadcrumbs is by pinning the chat. So instead of having all these chats that scroll down over a menu, I can pin it. And so now what it does, it pops up to the top. So no matter how many chats I get here at the top, I will have this one always pinned at the top. Now, you have a limit of 15 chats pinned. I found that because I hit it, but it's 15. Again, here's another example. This is Project ABC. Like if this is a short-term project, for example, maybe I want to pin that one at the top. So it makes it easier for me to navigate to it as opposed to having to scroll through my chat window. So I always like to illustrate that, adding members to a chat, pinning a chat, creating a group chat, as well as renaming the group chat. So now what I want to show you though is that so Stephanie sent me a message here. I'm gonna select this. So did you have a chance to review my email? Now, one of the things about chat communication is that it's just a stream of consciousness, meaning it might be hard to distinguish between what you're replying to. Am I replying to this comment here, or am I replying to this comment, or am I replying to this comment? There's ways to do that in the Teams section of Teams, but if you want to do that in the chat section of Teams, you can't just type a new message down here. Right? What you have to do is you hover over this chat, click on the breadcrumbs, and then hit reply. So then, now you don't have to do that, but if you want to be very clear with an individual chat or a group chat that you're replying to this message versus another message, this is how you can do it. And so instead of just, because if I just replied here, Stephanie might be wondering, well, which part of our chat am I replying about? Versus if I hover over it, click the breadcrumbs and click reply, it's very clear that I'm replying to this specific section of the chat. So those are some of the key things with chat. There's one other thing I like to show, for instance, especially for those of you that are trying to transition between Outlook and Teams and trying to understand how that works. One of the other options that exists once you hover over a message like this is that there is this option to share to Outlook. So this might be a way. So if you're trying to drive adoption in your organization and you're struggling between Outlook messages and emails versus Teams messages, which is a common challenge, this is a place where you can actually, I can send this to Stephanie. I'll send it to myself because that way I'll be able to show you the message. So I can actually pick this message. Notice what it does, basically grabs a screen grab of that message, and then allows me to send an email popping open in Outlook, and I'm going to go ahead and hit send. So sharing to Outlook is one of the things you can do that If you're trying to work with your team and drive behaviors towards teams, I think that's one of the ways to do that. If maybe they haven't looked in Teams, I'll show you how to do that in the Teams section of Teams as well. Okay, so that's really a lot of the nuances and idiosyncrasies around chat. I didn't want to spend too much time on all of that, but I definitely want to get into the Teams section of Teams now. So thank you, Microsoft, for, I'm going to show you this mug. Navigate to the Teams section of Teams to collaborate with your team. So we've created this mug just to kind of have some fun with the idiosyncrasies of Teams. So I always like to thank Microsoft in those moments. But one of the things that I wanted to show you is I'm going to come to the operations team here. I'm just, if you notice in the Teams section of Teams, this is the parent team, and these are channels. So it's talking about verbiage and making sure that we understand some of the nomenclature that that Microsoft uses so that we can be on the same page. These parent headings here are the team. Again, the Teams section of Teams. This is the team. And then these are the channels. So when you think about, when you use that language, that's what you mean. When you say operations team, general channel. So that's what I'm going to pop into. I'm going to start a new conversation. And I want to illustrate this by, so right now it looks very similar to a chat. But there's a couple things that I like to illustrate. When you're in a chat, you know exactly to whom you're communicating because the people are listed at the top of the chat. So it's really easy to see. If you're part of a team, first of all, you won't see it unless you're a member of the team. So you would not even see this unless you're a member of it. But if you're not sure who will see the message, if you're starting a new conversation here, you can actually come to the breadcrumbs right here of the operations team. You can click on this and hit manage team, and everyone can do this. And you can see who are the very first screen will show you who are the owners and members and guests of that team. So when I post this message that I'm about to show you, everyone here will be able to see it and reply to it by default. All right, so that's the way you can find out who will receive this message. Whereas in chat, it's a little bit more obvious because you're choosing the individual people that are part of the individual chat or the group chat. So I'm going to start a new conversation, and again, right now it looks very similar to chat. The piece that I want to highlight here is the this little icon right here that is so not intuitive, but it opens up one of the simplest but yet very great functions when you're trying to communicate with a group of people, which is effectively what a team is. So I'm going to click on the format button. And when you click on the format button, these other options open up. It gives you some basic formatting capabilities. It gives you a subject line. But then oftentimes I hear people want to say, well, I want to make a big announcement. Well, there's a little drop down that you can hit right here that changes it from a conversation to an announcement. So I like to relate this to in the past when you said an important company announcement, like for instance, earlier today, our organization received open enrollment for the new insurance renewals, right, going into the new year. So that would be something that in Teams, you could create open enrollment starting today, right? And say, please, right, please review your program. And then I can at tag the team to say, all right, at operations team. So that will give everyone a little notification. Please use this link. Now, if I had a link, I would paste it here, but I don't have the link to review your enrollment for the new year. Right, so this might be something that you could see in your organization where you want to make sure that there's a big announcement to it. There's also an option up here to click importance, so it gives it a little important notice. You're tagging it, and if I'm embedding a link, what I would do is I would actually use this, and I would use this to embed the link. So I put the link right here, and then I would click send. So now what you've done is you've created a new conversation, hence the button down here, new conversation. It's going to go to the operations team, so you know who's in the operations team. And I've made sure that it's very obvious and visually that it's an announcement, it's important. And I've tagged the people in it to say, these are the people that I want to get notified to make sure they see this message. And then I'll do one more thing when you think about going from Teams, again, if you're trying to drive adoption and your team is still trying to get used to the email versus Teams component, here's a little tip too. I would come over here. There's two things you can do. One, you can click on the breadcrumbs and you do the share to Outlook, just like what I suggested previously via chat. So we can do that. So I'm going to do that real quick just to give it an illustration because I want to show you how that looks. As that pops up, the other way to do it is copy the link and then share it in an email. Because ultimately what I'm trying to do, if I'm trying to drive adoption into Teams, so I'm going to send it to myself again just to give you an illustration. and click send. Ultimately, what I'm trying to do is I want to drive people back into Teams. So I might want to send them an email that gives them awareness because maybe they're paying attention to that more, but I want to drive them back into Teams. So I'm going to come over here and I'm going to hit copy link to this message, copy link. Great. And so now I'm going to open up my Outlook and I'm going to come up here. I'm going to start a new email and I'm going to say all company at MTP 365, subject, open enrollment, a notification in Teams. And then I would say, team, please refer to this conversation in Teams. You know, of course, I'd make it a little bit longer if that was the case. I'm going to right click. I'm going to embed that link. So now what's going to happen is I've sent an email. Hopefully that email pops up. I've sent that email. And so that email is then going to drive people, give people a link. So they've got the message and email, but it's going to give them a link and it's going to bring them right back to that message in Teams. So I'm hoping that this happens too. So that email is coming through. And this, notice this gives a screenshot of that message. So this kind of did the same thing and it gives a screenshot, which might make it easier to do actually. So either one works, just pick one if that makes sense. And if I click here, go to Teams, hopefully what it does, again, in theory, there it goes. It pops open exactly to this section, exactly to the message, and it kind of visually highlighted it for me. So that's one of the things, especially if you have those folks on your team, which we nearly all do. They're very comfortable with Outlook, very comfortable with email, used to getting notifications that way. I'm not saying don't send an email notification, especially when you're in this transition period, or even ever if you're trying to make sure everyone gets the message, is if the post is in Teams, put it in Teams, but then share it to Outlook or share it, you copy the link and it'll drive people back into Teams. That'll help drive adoption. Okay, so these are some of the main components of Teams versus chat, and understanding that a chat is one-to-one or one-to-many for a group chat, but it's typically for an ad hoc group, a short-term group, maybe just quick chat, but it's not necessarily for a long-standing organizational design, right? So the operations team, the marketing team, et cetera. So those are some of the reasons why you use chat versus Teams. And sometimes where I've seen people use chat is because they didn't know that they could really segment the conversations, which allows you to choose this conversation reply here versus here versus here versus any of the other conversations. So that's one of the things I'd like to highlight on some Teams basics is just getting used to the different communication methods. Now, finally, before we wrap up, I have one last section, and it's about meetings. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to do two things really quick. One, I'm going to share from Outlook into Teams. I wanted to show you that too. So sorry about that. So I've made a couple announcements. One, here's an announcement this is from my MyTech email address, so not my demo environment. So what I want to do is I'm going to come over here into Teams, and I want to share it into Teams. That's an option that exists between Outlook and Teams. There's also, once I've selected this email, there's a little button up here at the top you see, which is share to Teams as well. So I can select either one, but I'm gonna hit share to Teams. And notice this is an important update that's to the operations team. So I wanna use an illustration of, I could share it to a person. It says type a name of a person, group, or channel. So what I'm gonna do is operations. I'm starting to type that, and it's gonna give me the option to go to the operations team. So now, look, team, important update from client regarding project. Right, and now I can share, so I can take an email that I received from an external party, and I can bring it into Teams. I'll give you another example. So Stephanie sent me a marketing project update. So I'm gonna use this button up here instead this time. So I'm gonna hit send to share to Teams. And so now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna share this to the marketing team. It'll give me the option to pull up the marketing team right here. And it'll say marketing team client update. Again, trying to take an external email from someone else and then bring it into Teams, as opposed to now creating another email string internally for that with that same information. So I'm gonna go back into Teams really quick and notice in the operations team general, here is the email that was sent that I received externally that I shared into Teams and for the operations team. And now if I come down to the marketing team, hit the general channel, here hopefully is the marketing team client update that I just shared to the marketing team. So there's ways in which you can take a Teams message and share it to Outlook, and then take external emails or internal emails potentially, and then bring them into Teams very easily. Now the last section on meetings. Okay, if you're creating a meeting in Outlook, so I'm gonna go to the calendar, and I'm going to open up a new meeting. And I could have created like a new Teams meeting and all that, but I didn't. So notice when I created a new meeting, it defaulted to using Teams. You can change that. But this, when you create a meeting this way, this link will actually create a group chat. So the way it shows up in your Teams environment, once you start that meeting, it'll show up as a group chat. And similar to, I'll show you in the chat section, these are group chats that have been created in Teams. So you can kind of see their meetings. It's where you get the calendar icon. So those have been group chats that were basically created by sending a calendar invite like this. I could also choose at this time to don't host online. And that is when I can turn off the Teams invite, or I could turn it back into a Teams meeting. One of the little nuances that I like to share, that if you create the meeting and send it out, and then you come back and delete the Teams link, Outlook will still remember that you created it as a Teams meeting, and it will remember the link, and it will still give you the option to join when you hover over it in the calendar view. What I mean by that is I'll show you the calendar view. If you have a meeting like this and how it gives you the join, that join button will appear even if you delete the link inside of the calendar invite. And so that's one of the reasons why I like to show when you're creating a meeting, you have to choose right now before you send it whether you're going to host it online or not. And then, so I do not want to save changes. I want to quickly show you where to adjust those settings. So if you come into to the file menu, right, go to the file menu and you go to options. And when you go to the calendar gives you an option right here, say add online meeting to all meetings. When you click on here, it gives you the option to say this checkbox right here is what will mean that every time you create a meeting, it will always create a Teams meeting. Or if you uncheck this box, it will not always create a Teams meeting. You have to intentionally select it. If you have multiple virtual meeting options like Zoom or Teams or others, those options might appear here if you've integrated them with your organization, and if you could choose which one you want to default to when you create meetings or not. But this is how you can change that setting. So I wanted to illustrate that. The last thing I wanted to show you is the meetings in Teams before we wrap up is going to the calendar section of Teams. So I'm gonna, oops, that's not what I meant to do. Sorry about that. I must have just barely the calendar section of Teams. And in the calendar section of Teams, I'm going to create a new meeting up here. And as I mentioned before, if you create an Outlook invite, that will basically create a group chat for that call, that virtual call and meeting. But here, if you create a new meeting inside of the Teams calendar, you have an additional feature that does not exist when you're in Outlook, and that is adding it to a channel. So if I'm part of the marketing team, and I want to hold a meeting in the marketing channel, this is how I do it. Now, I still need to invite, I'll invite, say, Stephanie, and I'll invite JF, who are on our marketing teams, and I'll just say marketing team meeting, and I can even create a recurrence. So that happens, not daily, sorry. It happens weekly, let's say every, and pick, I don't know, a couple months out, I'm just going to pick some random dates. Valentine's Day, might as well. So it happens every Tuesday from 1:30 to 2 o'clock, and it will meet in the channel. So when I do this, so I'm gonna go ahead and click send. And so it's creating the meeting invite right now. And when you meet here, what it's gonna do is it's actually gonna create a meeting inside of the marketing team channel. So this is the meeting I just created every Tuesday, 1:30 p.m. until 2:14. So this is where it creates the meeting, so that when you're holding that meeting, you're meeting in your respective team's channel, not in a group chat. And so you can only do that. You can only create the link for your channel when you do it inside of the calendar section of Teams. And of course, it gives you the join button. So it doesn't look any different when I open this up now. Notice the link, it looks exactly the same as if I created it via Outlook, but this link makes it meet inside of the marketing team. It doesn't, instead of being a group chat. So that is pretty much the end of Teams basics for this session. So let me wrap it up with, look, Teams basics. Look, understanding to use chat versus Teams for intended purpose. Chat for ad hoc, one-to-one. Teams, which is if you're a member of that team or knowing who the people are in that team, the different ways in which you can create conversations and conversation strings, sharing back and forth from Outlook if appropriate. Look, I really want to help people increase familiarity and the comfort to use these tools so that you can get better adoption and get people more comfortable in interacting and raising their hand. And look, this starts the journey of rowing in the same direction. I want every organization to be able to optimize how they use these tools, and by getting everyone on the same page will help you do that. And ultimately, it helps you have fewer clicks to get the job done, which is what we really like to be able to do, is fewer clicks to actually accomplish what we're trying to do. So in the future, please subscribe to our YouTube channel or follow us on LinkedIn. If there's anyone you think could benefit from these events, please share them. Would love to have you share that. And join us for future events, mytech.com/events. We have in-person and virtual events that we do moving forward. And then, you know what, I always like to say, if your organization would ever like help with Teams and SharePoint, we'd be happy to chat. We can help you out and see if you on your journey of driving adoption. With that said, I'd like to thank everyone for attending, and let's open it up for some questions. But for those that are dropping off, I hope you stay secure and be productive. But let's open it up for questions for those who can stick around.